Good evening. 20 million barrels of oil per day have stopped flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, and the world is only now beginning to understand what that number really means. It means gas lines that stretch parks in cities that thought they were immune to the energy shocks of the 1970s. It means jet fuel prices doubling in less than a month, forcing airlines to cancel routes that have been profitable for decades. It means fertilizer costs spiking so fast that farmers from Kansas to Kenya are already calculating whether it makes sense to plant a full crop this season. The United States and Israel launched an air campaign against Iran in late February, expecting Tehran to respond with missiles and ground forces. Instead, Iran effectively closed the strait, naval mines, attacks on merchant vessels, and a simple terrifying warning to tanker operators: turn around or lose your ship. Within days, the major shipping lines pulled out completely. And what we are witnessing now is not a supply disruption. It is a cardiac arrest for the global energy system. Now, here is the question I have been hearing from viewers all day, and I want to put it directly to you before we go any further. When you look at the prices at your local pump, when you calculate what it is going to cost to heat your home or fly to see your family, who do you blame more? The leaders who launched this war, or the leaders who failed to prepare for the consequences? Take a moment, think about it, and let us know in the comments. Because the answer to that question is about to shape not just the midterm elections in the United States, but the entire geopolitical order of the next decade. And here is why. While Donald Trump is busy blockading that same strait and picking public fights with NATO allies who refuse to send warships, something extraordinary is happening just north of the American border. Almost nobody is talking about it. Canada, the country Trump has spent the last year and a half trying to humiliate, bully, and absorb into the United States as a 51st state, is quietly becoming one of the most powerful energy players on the planet. Prime Minister Mark Carney knows it. He's not just sitting on the world's third largest oil reserves while the East burns. He is using those reserves, using them against Trump, against everyone who bet that Canada would fold under pressure. And if you are an American filling up your gas tank right now at prices that have climbed above $4 a gallon and are still climbing, you need to understand that what happens next between these two leaders could determine whether that price goes up or comes back down. Because the mainstream media has been missing the bigger picture entirely, and that picture is more dangerous and more promising than most people realize. Let us start with the scale of the crisis, because without understanding the numbers, none of the politics will make sense. The head of the International Energy Agency called the Hormuz closure the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Brent crude surged past $120 a barrel. Gas prices across the United States punched above $4 and kept rising, hitting an average of $447 in early June, according to the latest AAA data. Jet fuel more than doubled. Diesel, the absolute lifeblood of truck and agriculture, went through the roof, with spot prices in some markets exceeding $6 a gallon. Fertilizer prices, heavily dependent on Gulf exports of sulfur and urea, began spiking in ways that agricultural economists warned could trigger a food price crisis reminiscent of 2022, when grain markets convulsed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Airlines started rerouting flights around the entire Middle East, adding hours to routes and millions in fuel costs. Stock markets tumbled. Recession odds climbed across every major economy, with the Federal Reserve's own models now putting the probability of a contraction in the second half of 2026 at nearly 40%, and Donald Trump, who launched this war expecting a quick, decisive operation that would showcase American military power and force Iran back to the negotiating table, found himself trapped in a conflict that is bleeding American wallets dry. The White House had planned for a 72-hour air campaign followed by a ceasefire brokered by Gulf allies. Instead, Iran's strategy of closing the strait turned those 72 hours into 72 days of economic warfare that the United States is not winning. This is where Canada enters the picture, and this is where Mark Carney's strategy becomes genuinely fascinating. Within days of the strait closing, Canada's top trade officials began doing something they had never done at this scale before. They started calling energy buyers around the world, not just in the United States, but in Asia, in Europe, in countries that had been dependent on Gulf oil, and were suddenly desperate for alternatives. Canada's international trade minister went Bloomberg television from Seoul and delivered a pitch that was unmistakable in its ambition. He said conversations in South Korea were revolving around energy and what more Canada could do. Crude oil, liquefied natural gas, nuclear capacity. Canada has all of it, he said, and we are getting a lot of calls these days. That might sound like standard diplomatic language. In context, it was a declaration of strategic intent. Canada is positioning itself as the reliable, stable, democratic alternative to the chaos of the Middle East. While Iranian mines threaten tankers in the Gulf, Canadian oil is flowing safely through pipelines in Alberta. While Russian energy remains tainted by sanctions in the war in Ukraine, Canadian energy comes with none of that baggage. And while American oil producers are also benefiting from the crisis, with shale output up modestly in the Permian Basin, there is a crucial difference. Canada is using this moment not just to make money, but to build long-term relationships that will reduce its dependence on the United States. And that is the part that should worry Washington. Here is the strategic problem Trump created for himself, and he does not fully grasp the implications yet. For decades, the United States has been Canada's overwhelmingly dominant energy customer. Roughly 99% of Canadian oil exports go to a single country, the United States. That kind of dependence has always been a source of American leverage. If Canada steps out of line, Washington can threaten to restrict imports or impose tariffs on energy, and Ottawa has nowhere else to send its oil. Trump exploited that leverage relentlessly. He slapped tariffs on Canadian energy. He threatened to raise them further. He used Canada's energy dependence as a cudgel to force concessions on everything from dairy markets to digital streaming regulations. The assumption was always that Canada was trapped, that it had no alternative. But the Hormuz crisis is rewriting that equation in real time. Suddenly, the world does not have enough oil. Countries that never considered buying Canadian crude are now desperate for it. Japan, which gets 70% of its Middle Eastern oil through the Strait of Hormuz, is scrambling for new suppliers. South Korea is sending special envoys to secure alternative energy sources. European nations that relied on Qatari LNG are watching their supply contracts crumble under force majeure declarations. And Canada, with the third largest proven oil reserves on Earth, is sitting in a position of extraordinary strength. Now, there is a problem, and this is the frustrating irony that has haunted Canadian energy policy for decades. Canada cannot fully capitalize on this moment because it does not have enough pipeline capacity to get its oil to global markets. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, the only major pipeline carrying Canadian oil to the Pacific coast, is already operating at 91% capacity. There is no room to dramatically increase exports to Asia. The dream of building a pipeline from Alberta to the coast of British Columbia has been strangled for years by environmental opposition, indigenous rights disputes, and political gridlock. The Keystone 40 pipeline, which would have carried even more Canadian oil to American refineries, was killed by President Biden on his first day in office and never revived. So, Canada has the oil. The world wants it, but Canada cannot get enough of it to market. It is like having the biggest well in the desert and no bucket large enough to carry the water. And yet, even with these constraints, the political and strategic dynamics have shifted enormously in Carney's favor. Here is why. The Hormuz crisis has done something that no amount of Canadian rhetoric or diplomatic pressure could ever have achieved on its own. It is proven in real time with real consequences measured in dollars at the gas pump and dollars on the grocery shelf that the world's dependence on Middle Eastern energy is a catastrophic vulnerability. And it has forced a question that energy strategists have been asking for years into the center of the political conversation. Why is Canada not doing more to become a global energy superpower? Carney is leaning into that question hard. His government has started talking about energy security as a pillar of Canadian foreign policy. Not just an economic interest, but a strategic weapon. The argument is straightforward and powerful. Democratic allies should not have to choose between buying oil from Russia, which is using energy revenue to fund its invasion of Ukraine, or buying oil from the Gulf, where supply can be cut off by any conflict in a region perpetually on the edge of war. Canada offers a third option: stable governance, strong environmental regulations, geographic proximity to both American and markets through the Pacific, and reserves that could last for generations. This is where the US-Canada trade fight intersects with the Hormuz crisis in a way that creates maximum pressure on Trump. Because right now, Trump needs Canadian energy more than ever. American refineries, particularly the heavy ones on the Gulf Coast, are designed to process the exact type of heavy crude that Canada produces. Without it, those refineries would have to import heavy crude from somewhere else. And with the Middle East in flames, the alternatives are limited. Venezuela, which was briefly back on the market after Trump desanctioned some of its production, does not have the infrastructure or stability to fill the gap. Russia is off-limits for political reasons. That leaves Canadian oil as one of the most critical inputs into the American refining system at the exact moment when Trump is trying to keep gas prices from derailing his party's chances in the 2026 midterm elections. Carney knows this. He knows that every day the Strait of Hormuz stays closed, his leverage grows. He knows that every cent gas prices rise in the United States, Trump's political vulnerability deepens. And he knows that the upcoming USMCA trade review, which could reshape the entire North American economic order, is happening against the backdrop of an energy crisis that makes Canada indispensable. Now, Trump is not a fool. He understands leverage, too. His response to the Hormuz crisis has been characteristically aggressive. After peace talks with Iran collapsed over the weekend in Pakistan, Trump announced a full naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. He declared that the U.S. Navy would prevent all ships from entering or leaving the strait until Iran opens it to everyone. The move is partly aimed at choking off Iran's remaining oil revenue, but it also carries enormous risks. If the blockade escalates into a direct naval confrontation with Iran's Revolutionary Guard, oil prices could spike even higher, potentially breaking $150 a barrel. If the blockade drags on for months, the pressure on American consumers will become politically unsustainable. Meanwhile, Trump has been raging at NATO allies for refusing to help. He called the alliance a paper tiger. He threatened to withdraw the United States entirely. He demanded that European countries send warships and military assets to the strait, and one after another, they declined. The United Kingdom said it would not participate in the blockade. France and Germany said any reopening of the strait would require a durable peace agreement with Iran, something that looks increasingly distant. And right in the middle of all this, Mark Carney did something that was strategically brilliant and provocatively timed. He reaffirmed Canada's commitment to NATO and its focus on Arctic security, carefully positioning Canada as a loyal but independent ally. He is not rejecting NATO. He is not rejecting the alliance with the United States, but he is making it clear that Canada's military cooperation and energy cooperation are not free goods that Trump can demand, while simultaneously threatening Canadian sovereignty and slapping tariffs on Canadian industries. This is the calculation Carney is making, and it is a high-wire act of extraordinary complexity. He is betting that the combination of the Hormuz crisis, Trump's political vulnerability on gas prices, the USMCA review, and Canada's irreplaceable role in American energy supply gives him enough leverage to negotiate a fundamentally better deal for Canada. Not just a trade deal, a new kind of relationship where Canada is treated as a genuine partner rather than a colonial resource to be exploited. But there are enormous risks. If Trump feels cornered, he tends to escalate rather than compromise. He could impose even higher tariffs on Canadian energy as punishment for what he perceives as insufficient loyalty. He could try to rewrite the USMCA in ways that strip Canada of its remaining protections on dairy supply management or dispute resolution mechanisms. He could use the crisis to justify even more extreme rhetoric about annexation and the 51st state, rallying his political base even as that rhetoric spooks markets and undermines investor confidence. And if global energy prices remain elevated for another 6 months, both American and Canadian consumers will suffer, creating domestic political pressure that could undermine Carney's position from within. There is also the pipeline problem, which is not going away. Canada cannot become a true energy superpower if it cannot get its oil to Asia. The Trans Mountain expansion helped, adding roughly 590,000 barrels per day of capacity. But it is not enough. Building new pipeline infrastructure to the Pacific coast remains politically toxic in British Columbia and among environmental groups that form a key part of Carney's political coalition. This is the strategic contradiction at the heart of Canada's energy ambitions. Carney talks about diversification and independence, but his country remains structurally dependent on the American market because it has not built the infrastructure to reach anyone else. Some analysts have pointed out the dark irony. Canada ships 99% of its oil to a single customer while simultaneously complaining about dependence on that customer. It is a country with the resources to be an energy superpower, but the political culture of a country that cannot get out of its own way. Still, the trajectory is clear. The Hormuz crisis has accelerated a shift in global energy politics that was already underway. Countries around the world are rethinking their energy supply chains. Long-term contracts are being renegotiated. New partnerships are being explored, and Canada, despite its infrastructure limitations, is in the conversation in ways it has never been before. Here is what happens next. Carney will use the Hormuz crisis as his primary argument in the USMCA negotiations, which are scheduled to begin in earnest this September. He will tell Washington that Canada is not just a trade partner, but a strategic energy asset, and that treating it as a hostile state through tariffs and annexation threats is self-defeating. He will push for tariff reductions on Canadian energy as the starting point of any deal, knowing that Trump's own economic advisors understand the importance of cheap Canadian crude to American refining capacity. And he will use the global attention on energy security to make the case at home and abroad for finally building the pipeline and export infrastructure that Canada needs to break free of its overwhelming dependence on the American market. Trump, meanwhile, will try to take credit for the energy crisis driving investment into North American production. He will frame the blockade as proof of American military strength, and he will use the USMCA review to extract maximum concessions from Canada, particularly on dairy, digital regulation, and alignment with Washington's approach to China. But the gas prices that are eating into his popularity will constrain his options in ways his rhetoric does not acknowledge. You cannot simultaneously punish your biggest energy supplier and keep gas cheap. The math does not work. The deeper question, the one that goes beyond any single negotiation or crisis, is whether this moment represents a permanent shift in the US-Canada relationship. For decades, the assumption in both countries was that their economic integration was a done deal, locked in by geography, history, and mutual interest. Trump has shattered that assumption, and the Hormuz crisis has revealed just how much power Canada has been sitting on. Without fully realizing it, Mark Carney once ran two of the world's most important central banks, the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He spent his career managing crises that could have collapsed entire economies, from the 2008 financial meltdown to the Brexit shock. Now, he is managing the most consequential period foreign policy since Confederation. Whether he succeeds or fails will depend on whether he can turn this moment of unexpected leverage into lasting structural change, or whether it slips through Canada's fingers the way so many energy opportunities have before, for Americans. The lesson is simpler, but no less important. The country you have been taking for granted, the neighbor you have been threatening with tariffs and absorption, the ally you have been calling a 51st state, is the same country producing the oil you need to keep your economy running. And right now, they have other options. Not enough of them yet, but more than they had yesterday, and more tomorrow than they have today. That is the reality Donald Trump is waking up to, and it is a reality that no blockade, no tariff, and no Truth Social post can change. We will continue to track every twist in this story, from the naval maneuvers in the Gulf to the pipeline politics in Ottawa. For now, from all of us here, thank you for watching. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates. The strategic tension between Washington and Ottawa has reached a critical inflection point. Driven by the structural reality that the United States cannot achieve domestic price stability while maintaining an adversarial trade posture toward its largest energy supplier. This dynamic has exposed a profound mismatch between political rhetoric and economic necessity. While the public focus remains on geopolitical maneuvers in the Persian Gulf, the actual leverage is shifting toward a highly technical and heavily integrated North American supply chain that relies fundamentally on Canadian resources. On June 15, 2026, the American Petroleum Institute released a comprehensive briefing detailing the operating constraints of complex refineries along the United States Gulf Coast. The report confirmed that 74% of the processing facilities in Texas and Louisiana are structurally optimized for heavy, sour crude oil, a specific grade that cannot be easily substituted with lighter domestic shale oil. Because alternative global sources of heavy crude, predominantly Venezuela and Iraq, are severely restricted by logistical disruptions or international sanctions, these facilities are structurally dependent on a steady intake of Canadian bitumen. What this data reveals is that any attempt by Washington to impose punitive measures on Ottawa directly threatens the operational viability of the American refining sector. This technical dependence underpins the diplomatic strategy executed by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. During an emergency address to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in Toronto on June 17, 2026, Carney articulated a fundamental shift in how Ottawa views its economic assets. He stated that the era of treating continental resource integration as a passive arrangement is over, and that economic resilience requires a mutual recognition of strategic vulnerabilities. What that statement reveals is a deliberate choice to link energy security directly to trade negotiations, abandoning the traditional separation between resource diplomacy and broader economic agreements. This policy shift is supported by substantial structural changes within the Canadian energy landscape. Data published by the Alberta Energy Regulator on June 18, 2026, showed that daily production in the oil reached a record 3.9 million barrels, an increase of 210,000 barrels from the previous quarter. Crucially, 88% of this new volume was cleared through existing long-term contracts that are insulated from short-term market fluctuations. That structural insulation means that Canadian producers do not need to discount their product to attract buyers, a factor that eliminates the historic pricing disadvantage known as the Western Canadian Select Discount. The political implications of this economic stability are manifesting in American electoral metrics. An internal memorandum from the National Republican Congressional Committee, leaked to the press on June 19, 2026, indicated that consumer dissatisfaction with energy costs has reduced the ruling party's baseline support by 6.5% across 22 critical swing districts. The internal modeling suggested that if retail gasoline averages remain above $4 per gallon through October, the current legislative majority will likely collapse. This political vulnerability prevents Washington from utilizing its standard trade levers, such as the threat of broad import tariffs, because any reduction in Canadian supply would immediately trigger higher prices at the pump. Faced with these constraints, the American administration has attempted to bypass traditional diplomatic channels through direct engagement with provincial authorities. On June 16, 2026, the United States Department of Energy issued an invitation to the premiers of Alberta and Saskatchewan to participate in a bilateral energy security working group. The formal agenda focused on cross-border infrastructure protection and regulatory alignment for future pipeline expansions. This sequence is not coincidental. It represents an attempt to exploit historical political divisions between resource-producing provinces and the federal government in Ottawa. Ottawa anticipated this maneuver and acted to solidify federal authority over international commerce. On June 18, 2026, the Canadian Privy Council Office implemented an administrative directive requiring all provincial resource ministries to clear cross-border infrastructure proposals through a centralized federal review board. This directive effectively neutralizes any attempts by Washington to negotiate separate agreements with individual provinces. What that structural adjustment achieves is a unified bargaining position, forcing the United States to deal directly with Carney's federal administration. This internal alignment has allowed Canada to project its influence into international forums where energy security is being redefined. At the G7 Ministerial Meeting on Energy and Environment in Tokyo on June 19, 2026, Canada introduced a policy framework titled the Democratic Energy Security Initiative. The document proposes a formal system of carbon accounting and supply chain verification designed to favor stable democracies over authoritarian regimes in the procurement of strategic resources. That framework is intended to create a permanent institutional bias within Western economies toward Canadian energy products, systematically reducing the long-term market share of Gulf producers. The response from traditional allies highlights the growing fragmentation of the Western alliance. While the United States delegation urged the G7 to adopt an immediate resolution endorsing maritime security operations in the Strait of Hormuz, the European Union representatives blocked the motion, opting instead to support Canada's focus on supply diversification. This divergence indicates that European capitals are prioritizing long-term structural supply security over participation in an escalating naval confrontation. For Canada, this international support provides a critical layer of diplomatic insulation against potential American retaliation. The immediate battleground for this geopolitical friction is the upcoming review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, scheduled to begin formal technical sessions on September 4, 2026. Under the terms of the treaty's sunset clause, all three nations must explicitly confirm their intent to renew the agreement for an additional 16 years, or face mandatory annual reviews that introduce severe investment uncertainty. Washington had previously intended to use this review to demand concessions on Canadian dairy supply management and digital service taxation. However, the energy crisis has inverted the leverage, as Canada can threaten to delay renewal discussions unless Washington provides permanent exemptions for Canadian industrial exports. To counter this strategy, the United States has begun exploring alternative domestic measures to lower energy costs without relying on foreign policy concessions. On June 17, 2026, the White House directed the Environmental Protection Agency to issue emergency waivers allowing the year-round sale of high ethanol fuel blends, a move designed to stretch existing gasoline inventories. Additionally, the Department of the Interior announced an accelerated schedule for oil and gas leasing on federal lands in Alaska and the western states. These domestic interventions are intended to signal that Washington can tolerate a prolonged dispute with international suppliers. Market analysts, however, question the efficacy of these domestic measures. A study published by the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies on June 19, 2026, concluded that emergency regulatory waivers and new leasing schedules require a minimum of 18 to 24 months to generate meaningful physical volumes in the retail market. The study emphasized that no domestic policy can immediately replace the 4.3 million barrels of crude oil that flow daily from Canada into American refineries. This analysis reinforces the reality that short-term political survival for the current administration remains tied to Ottawa's cooperation. As both sides refine their positions, the strategic focus is narrowing toward a singular corporate milestone that will test the boundaries of this economic leverage. On September 12, 2026, the Board of Directors of Enbridge, North America's largest energy infrastructure company, will convene in Calgary to cast a definitive vote on the funding mechanism for the Line 5 tunnel project beneath the Straits of Mackinac. This infrastructure link carries 540,000 barrels per day of light crude and natural gas liquids from Western Canada through Michigan to refineries in Ohio and Ontario, and it has been the subject of intense regulatory and legal disputes between state governors and federal authorities. The outcome of that single boardroom vote will determine whether the primary logistical artery connecting Canadian supply to the industrial heartland of the United States will be expanded or systematically dismantled. Synthesizing this matrix of technical constraints, legislative vulnerabilities, and diplomatic maneuvers reveals that the conflict is no longer contained within the geographic boundaries of the Persian Gulf. What began as an unpredicted asymmetric response to an air campaign has evolved into a structural reordering of continental alignment. This shift forces a complete reassessment of how state power is calculated when resource dependency intersects with political survival. The escalating friction between Washington and Ottawa demonstrates that traditional leverage is highly perishable when an external shock exposes an economy's fundamental physical vulnerabilities. For Canada, this moment provides an unprecedented mechanism to transition from a subordinate trade partner to an independent strategic actor. By anchoring its resource assets within federal oversight and leveraging international alliances like the G7 and the European Union, Ottawa is systematically dismantling the historic assumption that it has no alternative to the American market. This strategic repositioning allows Canada to approach the upcoming trade review not from a posture of defense, but with an explicit mandate to reshape continental economic terms. The likely next move for Ottawa is to maintain its disciplined infrastructure timeline, while using the threat of regulatory delays to secure sweeping exemptions from American protectionist policies for the United States. The strategic landscape requires an immediate reconciliation between aggressive foreign policy goals and domestic economic realities. The structural dependence of Gulf Coast refineries on heavy Canadian crude means that any attempt to penalize Ottawa directly accelerates the domestic inflationary pressures that threaten the ruling party's legislative survival. This vulnerability severely limits Washington's bargaining capacity, rendering empty threats of annexation or punitive tariffs counterproductive. To mitigate this exposure, the administration will likely continue to pursue rapid domestic energy adjustments, though these interventions cannot alter the critical dependency in the near term. Beyond North America, the fragmentation of global supply chains is forcing major consumer economies to adjust their long-term procurement strategies. European capitals, already strained by previous energy shocks, are prioritizing structural supply diversification over participation in regional naval blockades, signaling a growing reluctance to subsidize Washington's geopolitical calculations. Similarly, Asian economies like Japan and South Korea are actively shifting diplomatic resources towards stable democratic producers to shield their industrial bases from maritime choke points. This international realignment accelerates the formation of new trading blocs, permanently reducing the geopolitical premium historically commanded by traditional Middle Eastern suppliers. Ultimately, this crisis underscores a broader transformation in the nature of modern geopolitical leverage. The traditional instruments of superpower influence, naval projection, unilateral trade dominance, and public diplomacy are increasingly constrained by the rigid physical realities of integrated supply chains and processing infrastructures. When a critical economic input cannot be easily substituted, the nation that controls the source possesses a structural advantage that cannot be erased by political rhetoric or regulatory mandates. This dynamic redefines the relationship between great powers and middle powers, establishing resource reliability as the primary currency of strategic autonomy. The single most important takeaway from this confrontation is that economic integration is an instrument of mutual vulnerability, not a one-way street for the exercise of imperial leverage. By forcing the world to acknowledge that physical resource security overrides political alignment, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has permanently broken the continental framework that defined North American commerce for half a century. Washington can no longer